Hi, welcome to Get Into Woodworking with me, Mitch Peacock. This time we're going to be making a really big improvement on our box. I'm going to be giving you some exercises to try with your chisel, so I hope you've been sharpening like I taught you last time. And we'll also have some exercises with a saw. I hope you enjoy it. So, after the previous improvements on the box, I realised that I'd have to start again before I could make any further improvements. So I glued up the parts I had, clamped it all with the masking tape, and let's see what we've got and look at how we can improve it. I think the first thing we notice is we didn't inset the ends of the base into the sides, so we can actually see a bit of a gap there. And we talked last time about the expansion across the grain on the bottom being potentially enough to blow out the sides, because the end has got long grain in this direction and therefore won't expand quite as much. So there's a couple of things we need to think about. The way we can address the bottom expanding too much is if we fit it loosely in some slots. Having a slot for the base to slide into allows it to expand and contract without pushing the sides out. It's not particularly attractive having this step in the bottom of the box, so what we'll do is we'll create a little tongue on the top side of the base, such that when it's inserted in the slot in the sides, the bottom of the base will be level with the bottom of the sides. I've gone ahead and prepared two blank sides and also two ends, although I've left them still joined in the middle because it's easier to work the grooves on a longer section. First thing to do is to determine where we want the slot in the bottom of the sides. Now we know that our base is a certain thickness, and here's a piece we use for the base. The top of our slot doesn't want to be any higher up than the thickness of our base from the bottom of the sides. With that in mind, I'll take a marking gauge and set it to the thickness of our base. Now I'll gauge that line along the bottom inside of both sides and of the ends. Now I'm going to reduce the gap on the marking gauge by about 1/8 of an inch. Then we can gauge another line in parallel with the first line, and that will mark out the material we need to remove. If I take my chisel now, I can just put a little notch on the insides of those lines to make it easier to start my saw. I'm going to set the depth for these to be approximately halfway through the thickness of the sides and ends. If I mark that, then when I do my sawing, I'll know when I've gone deep enough. In a bigger box, we wouldn't use the whole half of the material. We'd perhaps do 1/4 of an inch, or maybe 3/8. Then taking our saw, lay it into the notch at the end, line it up with the gauge line, and just cut down to depth. Once you've completed the first cut, move the saw over, rest against the other side and cut that one. This time your line is on the other side of the saw. Now we just need to remove this material in the middle. My preference might be for a small router plane, but because we haven't introduced that tool, I'm going to use what we've got, which is the saw again. So I'm placing the saw in the one saw cut on the right hand side, leaning the saw over to the right and then cutting through the middle of that waste. And there's the first piece out. Then we drop the saw in the left hand side, tilt it over and start sawing out towards the right hand side. There's less material this time because some of it came out on the first cut. Then just adjust the tilt of the saw against the side of the cut so you take out all the material in the middle. This is quite tedious, and that's why the other methods are preferred. That's one side down, another side and the ends to go. Now I'll mark up the sides to rebate the ends in like we did last time. With the gauge set to the width of the ends, I can now gauge lines at the ends of both of the sides, ready to prepare the rebates. Now I can deepen those gauge lines with a marking knife and a tri-square. Now I reset the gauge to leave about 1/3 of the thickness of the side and mark that on all the ends. And along the edge to gauge the depth when we saw. Now we can cut the ends of the rebate using the knife line to guide the saw. And just going down to the depth line. Now I'm using the vise here, but you could clamp these to the side of the workbench if you don't have a vise, just to cut the other side of the rebate. And I've put two sides back to back here so I can cut the other one without taking it out the vise. And if the corners need cleaning out, just take your chisel and just pair them nicely into a sharp corner. Now I can cut my two sides apart, and you'll notice I've got a fair amount of waste in the middle here, so I'm making two separate saw cuts. That ensures that all the measurements stay nice and accurate. Now we can assemble the sides and the ends, and you'll see that the groove continues right around the corner. To measure for the base, we'll hold an end between two sides and measure the gap, and here it's 70 millimeters. Then we'll measure the depth of the grooves we've made. That's 4 millimeters. So I want to leave a millimetre in the bottom of the groove for expansion, so we'll call the tongues 3 millimeters. So 2 3s plus the 70, we need to cut a base which is 76 millimeters wide. The length of the base wants to be the distance between the two rebates, which is 144 millimeters, and then we want to add 3 millimeters either end for the tongues. So that makes an overall length of 150 millimeters. I'm going to use this for my base. So now I need to measure off 150 in length. Mark that with a knife. And 76 in width. Now I can take a marking gauge, set the knife of that into the little knife mark I made for the width. Bring the fence up tight, do that up, and I can mark the width along that length. Then using the tri-square, moved up against the knife line for the length of the base, I can mark off for cutting the length. Make a little knife wall. I've set the marking gauge to about 3.5 mil. That will allow 0.5 mil expansion into the gap at the back of the groove. And then I just decide what's going to be the bottom of the base. It's going to be this side, and we'll mark on that side the 3.5 mil all the way around. So we'll be removing this material, and we need to do that to a depth which just leaves us something fractionally smaller than the groove we've made. So if we measure the groove, we'll see that's fraction over 2 mil. So now I'll reset my gauge to 2 mil. Now I can gauge that 2 mil from what's going to be the inside of the base. I've notched to start the saw, and then I can just follow the line . Now test that with the groove. That's good, that slides nicely, and we're nice and flush on the bottom. With the tongue created all round the base, we can put things together. And if we look on the back, we'll see we've got a little expansion gap which will stop any damage if the base decides to expand. Have a go at making one yourself, but don't glue it together yet because I've got an idea for a lid which we'll cover next time. Being able to saw accurately with the back saw, such as this dovetail saw, will enable you to cut much more precise joints, and anything you build will be that much stronger. So here's a few exercises. Grab yourself a piece of timber. Doesn't really matter what it is. This is actually come off an old pallet. Take a ruler and mark some lines down from the end. They don't need to be parallel. They just need to be straight, like so. Hold it in the vise or clamp it to the side of your bench, and then the exercise is to saw down in a straight line along the lines that you've created. So that may be perpendicular or it may be at a slight angle. Your aim is to follow the line exactly. What you should be doing is starting the saw in the right position for the whole cut before you go anywhere at all. You can just take a couple of pullbacks on the saw to get a little notch started, but from that point on you want the saw at the right angle and you don't want to move it during the cut. So I don't suppose I did very well, not being able to see the line, but hey, when you do it you'll be looking at the lines. For the next exercise, set a marking gauge to half the thickness of the wood and mark a line down the side. And also on the other side. Now take a tri-square and draw a number of lines across the wood. I've just marked in the gauge line with a pencil so you can see it clearly, and the exercise here is to saw every line down to but no further than the gauge line. You might like to make yourself one of these. It's a mirror in a little stand which I can put at the back of the bench so that I can see down behind the work and see when I approach the line. Remember, saw down to but no further than that line. When you've finished, all your pencil lines should have disappeared. And you should be just down to the line and no further on this side as well. Final exercise is to take the tri-square and to knife off a squared line across a piece of wood. Use a chisel to prepare a knife wall. Then cut that line and check how square you are with the tri-square. you should be spot on. And don't forget to check the angle this way as well. Hi, you saw me sharpen this chisel last time. Well, it's done a bit of work now, and I've just come back to the MDF with the honing paste on top to give it a quick hone. I've not put any more paste on this time. What's on there should be fine. Just put the chisel down on the heel of the bevel, raise it up to the primary and that little bit further, and draw it back a few times. You should be able to feel a little burr on the end. Flip it over and then drag it, pressing really firmly down on the heel of the bevel. A couple of times. Now that should be as sharp as it was last time. Clamp a batten tightly against your bench or in a vise, and then using the chisel, holding it in both hands, just pare away bevels on the end of the batten. This will get you used to how the chisel cuts, and it'll also get you used to the fact that part way through a cut it can suddenly snap like that, and that's when you need to make sure your fingers are out the way. Clamping the blade behind the edge with one hand acts as a brake, so if suddenly it gives way as I'm coming across the top, my finger hits the work and the blade stops. It acts like a brake. Once you've created the bevels, just reduce the top surface, trying to keep it as flat as you can. Use the fact that the back of the blade is flat, so you reference off that and you'll maintain a flat surface. Once it is flat, of course, the blade's not going to want to cut anything. So a little bit more pressure towards the front. Once you've flattened the top, put a new set of bevels on and do it again. Take a rough piece of wood, clamp it in your vise or to the side of your bench, and then just practice flattening that area without getting tear out. Going in the direction of the grain, you're always at risk of digging in or tearing out material. So try working across the grain, or at least at diagonals. Taking small controlled strokes. Holding the flat of the chisel against the work as a reference when you end up with a flat surface eventually. It's most unlikely you'll ever have a task like this to do in your woodwork, but it's the skills you build up and the memory you build up in your hands that will help you with all sorts of tasks. it's worth practicing with the bevel down as well. With the heel of the bevel on the work, nothing will happen. As we gradually raise the handle up, the cutting edge will come over and start to take a shaving. And the angle we hold the chisel will determine how far it wants to dive down into the wood. So just practice doing that. Practice producing a flat surface riding on the bevel. And also practice creating a concave surface. So we dive in and gradually lower the handle and we come out of the work. Down and then out. Down and out. And you'll get to an angle where you start getting tear out. So you need to come around to the other side and complete it from there. Learning how a chisel works when it cuts wood, and that's done just by practicing, will allow you to choose the best technique when you want to create a joint. Making that notch was much easier using the bevel down to get to that stage, and then if we turn the chisel round, we can check and correct for any slight inaccuracies in flatness. So, sharpen your chisel and get practicing. Whilst we're talking about chisels, some of them are not designed to be struck with a hammer or a mallet. This chisel is a paring chisel. It has a handle with no ferrule at the end. If it got struck too much, then that end would be destroyed. It has a ferrule at the other end where the tang goes in to stop the force of the tang splitting the wood out, but it's designed primarily to be used grasped in one hand and pushed through the work. This chisel, on the other hand, is a socket chisel. The handle is attached into a socket formed in the actual blade, and this is a mortise chisel. Has a hornbeam handle. You can see how the handle's tapered on the end for a lovely good fit in the end of the socket. Once that's been struck, it doesn't want to come out, and this one can be struck, and it will depend on the species of wood whether or not you can hit the chisel, and also on the design. This is designed with a very flat top, so when you hit it, the force goes down through the middle of the chisel and you're not breaking out anything around the edges. And I've cut mortises with this chisel many times, and you can see there's very little damage on the end. That's because I use this particular hammer. It's 300 grams. The face of it is lovely and smooth, so it doesn't do any scratching or nicking of the top of the wood. I get a lovely contact with it, and it's a lot more, I feel, a lot more responsive than using a mallet. Other chisels are designed specifically for metal hammers. They have a ferrule around the top of the handle to stop any splitting out. The wood coming through the end of the ferrule, as it's hit, just mushrooms over slightly, cover the end of the ferrule. As you hear, I'm hitting wood there rather than the metal of the ferrule, and that stops any splitting out. So that's a chisel that is designed for hitting. Of course, any chisel can be used for paring. This is a synthetic handled firmer chisel. That's like a bevel edge chisel in that the thickness of the blade is about the same, but there are no bevels on the edges of this. It's got a rectangular section. It's debatable whether you should strike them with a metal hammer or not. I do, because I just prefer the action it gives, and I get very little damage on them. Quite new on the market, as far as I'm aware, are chisels where the blade continues right the way through the handle, ending in a striking cap on the end. And again, they can be hit with a hammer without any worries. Here's an example of a chisel that shouldn't have been hit with a hammer. I picked this up second hand to show you exactly what can happen. A huge chunk has split out of this, I guess it's perspex handle, acrylic handle, and it's actually a Sorby chisel, so great shame. As you can see probably through it, there's a tapered tang in there set within this resin, and it should never have been struck with a hammer. If you decide to use a hammer, do prepare one specifically for using with chisels. Polish the end on some 400 grit paper. I say polish, I mean, you'll still feel a very, very slight roughness on there, and that's good because it means it doesn't skip off the top of the chisel.